for International Relations here at the Center. And I was actually hired last April to launch English language activities here at the Center. It's been open since 1997, but almost everything has been in Korean. But now that's changing. We had an international conference co-hosted with the Nauman Foundation in July about the EU-Korea Free Trade Agreement. In August, we had a roundtable discussion with Marcus Cole of Stanford University Law School. And then in August, we had a really huge event. We brought a speaker from Greece, from the University of Athens, to talk about the issues there, the crisis there. And he warned Korea, please don't follow the road of welfare populism that Greece has been on. It's a dead end. And actually, Lee Myung-bak, the president, he actually talked about our speaker and mentioned him in his bi-weekly address to the nation, and he was invited to the National Assembly to give a talk. So we've been doing some exciting things. We have today's event, and in a couple of weeks, we're also going to have a huge event about Italy, which I should be able to send out some information within the next couple of days about that. All right, now, about the Center, I want to introduce you to the man who's behind all the motion and the commotion. All right, his name is Chung-Ho Kim, or Kim Chung-Ho, depending on how you want to pronounce it. Hold on, let me introduce you. All right, he is a man of action. All right, and actually that is one thing about him. He's a doer, not a talker. So there are always debates about Democrats versus Republicans, conservatives versus liberals, have versus have-nots. The big divide in the world is actually between doers and talkers. And he's one of those people that he is a doer. Another thing about him is that he is a yes man. And what I mean by that is that at a lot of Korean companies, the boss is really the boss. Okay? He orders it and the employees move. So slowly sometimes, but they move and they do what he says. At our company, when we say we have an idea, he's the one who says, yes, let's do it. And he's even more enthusiastic about it than we are in many cases. So he's a man of action. Now I want to introduce something that we did recently. So we have events, we have forums, we write papers, we write articles, we do many things. But something new that we've been doing is music. Talking about free markets. Yes, you can start it now. Okay, that's me. Okay, hold on. Okay, then I'll tell you. It's a rap battle that he's having with the professor at one of the local universities. He's arguing for free markets and defending the consumers. The other one is arguing for protecting small business. He's an actual rapper. He's released some CDs.
나이 95세, 키 175cm에서 몸무게 73kg에 부야스타 레몬스타는 시장경제의 전기사 자이경 원장 김정호! 무한은 강인 사회의 역사를 내보는 기업 국민과 김우경! 이번 배틀에 앞서 미국에서 아주 잘생긴 레플리 소개하겠습니다.
Okay, all right. So obviously this is a great place to work. We can do almost anything. So, all right. So please, Kim Chung-Ho.
Okay, thank you very much. And because I'm at work, I'm not going to speak. Just kidding. Welcome to the roundtable meeting of the CFE, and today's speaker is prestigious Professor Andrei Lankov. He's going to talk about the free market in North Korea. Is it?
Yeah, free.
Yes.
I would say so.
Oh,
it's
yeah.
a very funny situation, but anyway, yes.
Okay. And thank you for coming to give a lecture to the CFE and all the audiences. And let us enjoy the lecture and discussion with Professor Lankov. Thank you very much.
Okay, all right, thank you. Yes. All right, so just very briefly, he actually was a student at Kim Il-sung University in the mid-1980s. He grew up in a communist country. Which one?
Soviet Union.
Soviet Union. Okay, so he grew up in the Soviet Union, and he's published many books. You can see him, I think, on TV often. He writes in many places, and he is one of the hard-hitting analysts about North and South Korea. So he's going to talk for about 30 minutes to talk about the development of markets in North Korea. I guess good and bad about that. To introduce the other two, we have two distinguished guests here today, and I want them to offer commentary and also to kind of help the discussion along with questions also later. So first of all, Mr. Walter Klitz. He's with the Naumann Foundation. We're friends. We're friends. So we actually have worked together on some different projects. For example, the Free Trade Agreement conference that we had earlier this year. So he is the resident representative, I believe is the exact title, of the Naumann Foundation. And he is from Germany. And he actually lived through the time when they were having reunification, and he worked for the German government at that time. So he's a leading analyst when it comes also to Korean reunification and also many other issues. Now, something interesting about him is that he was actually a professional basketball player in Germany, and so that's something a little different about him. And we met in America about 9 years ago for the first time. And he's been to North Korea many times. Okay, and Donald Kirk, he will also be offering some commentary and analysis during the conversation. And he is with the Christian Science Monitor. And he has been published, I think, everywhere in the world. Seems like every major publication out there. And he's the author of the book, Korea Betrayed, Kim Dae-jung, and the Sunshine Policy. Okay, got it right. Okay, so, and he's been to North Korea, I think he said 8 times. So, and actually I think some of them have gone to North Korea together. So we have from Germany, from Russia, from America to talk about North Korea. Okay, so first of all, we'll start with Professor Lankov.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you for inviting me. I have 30 minutes. I hope that to make most of it. But if you read newspapers, I just made a search through newspaper articles database to discover that one of the most frequently used descriptions of North Korea is the world-class Stalinist country. I believe this description is seriously misleading. Because being somebody from the Soviet Union, I'm often asked which period of the Soviet history does North Korea now remind you of? I usually give my answer, and a couple of years ago, I overheard a person who has nothing to do with North Korean study. Essentially, he visited North Korea a number of times because of his business, a Russian, who said exactly the same as I did. And what I usually say, this question has no exact answer. Depends on the area. If we are talking about ideology, it looks like that much reminiscent of the Soviet Union of the late 1940s. The time when Comrade Stalin was still alive and went to the Kremlin every day, if he was not on his dacha in the Black Sea. If you are talking about the level of perception, the perception of the government, the official ideology, it's a bit like the Soviet Union of the 1970s. Everybody knows that the government is lying. But on balance, there is no open dissent, very little or no open dissent, and people still tend to believe that the basics is correct. We just have been so unlucky. And if we are talking about economy, it's very much similar to the post-Soviet economy. economy of Russia of the early 1990s in the first months and years immediately after the collapse of the Soviet state socialism. This is what I'm going to talk about now today. Because what has happened actually in North Korea is the emergence of de facto market economy. We have seen so far two ways out of the state socialism, which has proven to be a dead end. Looked very attractive on paper, did not work in real life. The first way was Chinese or Vietnamese or Lao. But the government basically said, from now on we are building capitalism. But we will still call it communism, just to make sure that nothing politically improper will happen. We stay in control, but from now on we are building capitalism. Then we had an option of Soviet Union and East Europe, when they essentially said that we are changing everything. We are changing political system, we are changing everything, and from now on we openly call capitalism a capitalism. And what was common with these two approaches? First, in both cases, the initiative belonged to the government. And in the case of North Korea, it looked like that the changes began to develop from below. So government didn't want reforms. Government, of course, was not overthrown as a result of the revolution, but the system collapsed anyway. I would say, I would describe it as, and I usually describe it as the natural death of North Korean Stalinism, or of North Korean socialism. There is a great deal of argument, because as you probably know, North Korea is a country where everything is a state secret. So, no reliable statistics is available. There have been attempts to estimate the scale of the private economy versus old-style state economy. And the results are vastly different. For example, quite recently, in 2008, Kim Jong-Un from the Seoul National University, his estimate was that roughly 80% of the North Korean economy, of the North Korean, to be more precise, 80% of the income of the average North Korean family comes from the private economic activities. It seems to be the highest estimate. The lowest estimate seems to be, say, 30% or something like that. But everybody agrees that private economy is very important and plays a large role in Korea, in North Korea, but even its existence is not admitted. People who don't deal with North Korea, they don't necessarily understand it, but you can spend years reading Nodon Sinmun and without encountering a single reference to the private economy. But you should not be surprised. We remember the currency reform of 2009, which produced a great social disruption, but as a matter of fact, it was never ever mentioned in the North Korean official open media. The country was in complete chaos for 2 months, and the media did not report anything about it at all. They didn't say that they had reformed, they didn't publish. It's a huge difference, as a matter of fact, with Stalin's Soviet Union, where the currency reform was always really, literally the front page news. The front page of the newspapers would be only about reforms. So, in this case, we shouldn't be surprised. So, statistics is very murky, statistics is extremely unreliable, and all these changes are clearly, the government doesn't want them. Because the North Korean government understands that in the long run these changes are extremely dangerous for the future, but they cannot do much about it. How did it all begin? It all began in the early 1990s, because before that, North Korea was unique in many regards, but it was probably the world's least monetary economy. It was an economy, because say, South Koreans tend to believe that every socialist country usually has a distribution and rationing, not the case. Even in the Soviet Union, there were only 3 periods when distribution and rationing existed. One in the late 20s, early 30s, then in the 1940s, and then from the late 70s. I'm repeating, between 1947 and 1978, there were no rationing in the Soviet Union. It didn't mean that goods were available. Usually they were not. But there were no rationing coupons and tickets. North Korea was a country where rationing became absolute. you could not buy almost anything, with the exception of essentially stationery, sometimes surprisingly good, books on very bad paper, and occasionally some sweets. Everything else would require rations, rationing tickets. You have rationing tickets, you could buy. If you had no, you couldn't buy. So everything was distributed by the state. The state decided where you should live, in which house you should live, how much you are supposed to eat, whether you are good enough to be given 700 grams of grain, or maybe you are especially good so you can be given 900 grams, or maybe you are just a housewife, so just 300 grams soy. And if you make money, it was essentially useless. Contrary to what is usually stated, markets existed at that period, but they were very small in size because there was not much supply. Unlike Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, North Koreans did not allow large private plots. The maximum size of a private plot in the countryside was merely 100 square meters, 30 Kirk, only. And it was the maximum possible size. Most people could not get that much. And everything began to change in the early 90s because this economy was absolutely, completely inefficient. It was made viable only by intake of aid from the Soviet Union and China. Russians and Chinese were giving money not because they liked North Korea. As a matter of fact, they hated North Korea. But there is such a thing as geopolitics, and it was politically necessary to keep North Korea afloat. Pretty much like the same logic now we can see in this case with China. But when the aid was withdrawn in 1991, it led to a dramatic collapse of economy. Again, we don't have statistics. If Bank of Korea estimates are to be believed, and I wouldn't say they are most reliable, I would say these estimates are the least unreliable estimates when it comes to North Korean economy. If these estimates are to be believed, the industrial output within 1 decade shrank roughly to half of what it used to be in 2000 compared to 1990. So most of the factories simply stopped working. And the government, and the rations were not delivered because government had no food. The state-run companies, the state-run farms could not produce because they didn't get fertilizers, they didn't get electricity, and of course farmers are never famous for hard work at the state-run companies. It was known everywhere across the globe. So food disappeared, people began to starve to death, and we had a massive famine which left between 500,000 and 1 million people dead. Don't believe in the figures 2 or 3 million, they are clearly propaganda exaggeration. But between 500,000 and 1 million, it still means it was the largest famine since insane experiments of Chairman Mao. People discovered that, well, for a while people were waiting for rations to come, and they did believe that rations would eventually come. But they did not. Some people, and many North Koreans say that people who were most kind of loyal, indoctrinated, they were first to die. Because the government kept telling them, wait for a while, rations were coming in 1994, 95, 97. And they were not coming. And people began to look for ways to basically make a living. And they sort of rediscovered capitalism. Unlike China, where the people were ordered to rediscover capitalism by the government. Unlike East European countries, where people essentially have had enough of socialism and chose capitalism themselves, in North Korea, it was not kind of political choice, it was just a way to stay alive. People began to do small businesses. First, workers were stealing everything which can be stolen in their factories, and they began to use non-functioning factories equipment to produce stuff for sale. Usually, just now, last few months, I was doing a bit of research on a particular factory, tobacco factory in northern part of the country. I'm interviewing all officials, accountants, workers, and they more or less agree that roughly 1/4 of the stuff is stolen from the factory now. But it's tobacco, it's very easy to steal, and it's highly profitable. Maybe for the average factory it will be low, but basically 1/4. They're stealing tobacco, they're stealing cigarette papers, which can be used for household production of tobacco stuff, everything. People are stealing. Farmers went to the mountains and they began to do their small illegal plots, illegal or semi-legal. And in the northern part of the borderland areas of North Korea, the produce of these plots probably roughly now maybe up to half of what they actually of entire agricultural production. But I'm talking about borderland area. Nationwide, it's much less. But people went to the mountains and they made some food for themselves and for sale. People began to move to China, which was not a political defection. They are usually described as political defectors. They are not political defectors. It was usually people it was usually economic immigration because they were running from famine, from starvation, and now they are looking for money because in China they can make an exorbitant salary of $50 to $70 a month. Because officially in North Korea the official salary is roughly $2 a month. Really people make more because once, as I have said, nobody, virtually nobody, with the exception of the top officials, now live on the salary. Everybody has a job in the official sector and everybody has a private job on top of that. So actual income is probably about $10 or maybe even $15 a month per person. Most money comes from private sector. But people went to China. People made began to grow their own food, people began to steal, people began to trade, and then they began to produce. What is quite important, we have a growing production, essentially light industry workshops, which are officially illegal, but everybody does it. People do whichever, you know. In this particular city, they produce footwear, they produce garments, they import raw material from China. They produce tobacco, local workshops, small private workshops. Essentially the technology of the 18th, maybe 19th century, but still it does exist. And they hire workers. It's essentially a kind of normal market economy. At the same time, government is seriously unhappy about it. Government keeps saying that it's not a good idea. Why? Because North Korean government understands that in the long run, such developments are dangerous for stability. What they most worry, they worry about two things, obviously. First, markets, huge markets, booming markets are essentially center of life of all Korean cities right now. And it's interesting to see, we did a bit of research about it, how in borderland cities, the market which used to be somewhere very small and somewhere on the margins of the city, how it gradually drifted to the center, to occupy the central part of the city, the best place, next to the party committee, next to Kim Il-sung or Kim Jong-suk's statue. So, and it's much larger. People began to trade on these markets. They began to sell stuff in the mid-90s, and every year they are doing more and more and more. And the government understands that this is dangerous because these markets, it's a hotbed of information exchanges, which is bad because the major worry of North Korean government is that North Korean people should not learn about life outside the country, especially in South Korea. Because spread of information about South Korean material prosperity will be a major blow to the legitimacy of the North Korean regime, and they are aware of that. And the second concern is people are getting out of control because their entire surveillance system has always been based on assumption that every able-bodied Korean has a job in the official state economy, and people disappear. So government keeps saying that it's not a good idea. Government occasionally stage crackdowns on the markets. Government says that soon everything will go back to the normal, so we again will have rationing. And what is important, North Koreans have lived under rationing for 60 years. For most people in the world, when you are talking rations are introduced in a country A, it means that the country A is in a crisis, yes? In North Korea, it's the opposite. If in the country A, rations are not delivered, or even government gave up on the rationing system, it's a complete disaster. They see rationing as the norm. A funny story about it from one of my South Korean colleagues. It's a story I love to retell. It's a story about, it's not the case anymore, because now North Koreans know much more. But back in the 1990s, he was in China, interviewing a North Korean refugee, defector, they say, but it's not really defector because it's just refugee, an old lady who just came to China. She has, by that time, had spent in China about 1 week. And he said, She said, I know, she said, that America is a rich country now. I know they were lying to us. America is a rich country. And the South Korean guys, well, Harmony, how rich America is, and she says, I know. In the US, they give rations of 800 grams of pure rice to everybody, even infants. Because for the poor lady it was, well, how rich country should be. First of all, pure rice, usually in her area, rice would be not more than 1/3 of the rations. Second, 800 is a special ration, above the average ration for the North Korean adult, which is on paper 700 grams, and it was reduced twice in 1973, 1987, so it's actually 547 grams a day, theoretically. And when she said so, it had been for a few years since she last time saw the ration, really, actually 547 grams ration. For her, it's an idea of a rich country. Not the case anymore, not the case anymore. People have learned that rationing probably don't exist in many other places. But government say, wait for a while, we'll have rationing, and now you males have to go to the factories and sit there to be prepared, because sooner or later we will restart production, and you have to protect the government property, protect equipment, and you have to be on guard against the South Korean spies who are, putting fires to there was a forest fire, it's South Korean spies. South Korean spies are poisoning chocolate pies, which this type of stories are going around quite frequent, large numbers. This is how it works. Government tries to push situation back because they understand people should not learn about their outside world, and they should not feel themselves independent. They should see government as the sole provider of all good things. And people try to survive. Frankly, unfortunately, contrary to what many people would like to hear, I believe that a significant majority of the North Koreans would be happy to go back to the old Kim Il-sung era of rationing and daily indoctrination sessions. Because it was the time that they were getting rations. And they would prefer it. Younger generation are different. The older generation, most of the North Koreans above the age of 35 or 40 would strongly prefer the old system, with the exception of those few who adjusted well to the new system. However, it's not going to happen, even though government keeps promising and promising are broken. So what was actually happening? I recently made a bit of fun about a publication of the Heritage Foundation, who published their graph of their economic freedom. And on this graph, economic freedom in North Korea looked like, very low. I do agree, it's very low. Going a kind of straight line from 95 to 2005, then dropping down, and slowly going down since then. I'm sorry, it doesn't reflect anything. It's seriously misleading. Because from 1995 to 2002, there was a gradual relaxation of this control. Government was losing control, and they tried to push people back. But first of all, when they were a bit successful, people began to die in even in greater numbers. Not that they worried about it that much, but they were not probably happy about it either. Plus, you need enforcers. To run the old system, you need enforcers. You need a lot of people whose only job is to spend 8 hours a day telling the masses how great the leader and how wise the leader is. And you have to have a lot of people whose only job is to file the reports of spies and spooks who are reporting everybody around. And these people need to eat. And the low-level officials in the 90s discovered that government is not paying them. So they began to ignore all the regulations. Because had they followed the law, corruption saved millions of lives in North Korea. Exactly because the old laws, which would make impossible all this kind of economic activities, were really never enforced. Because people who were supposed to enforce these laws, it was much more rational for them to accept payoffs, to accept bribes, and to stay to increase their income and to ignore this kind of activities. So a lot of law regulations are not enforced anymore. Technically, they are still at books. Technically, in North Korea, you still are not supposed to travel outside your town or county of residence. Everybody does it. You are not supposed to, of course, do any kind of private business. You are not supposed to, what you are not supposed else to do. No, everybody does. So travel, all kind of business activity. Of course, travels to China. Yes, exchange foreign currency. Everybody does it. And just to show what this old ban on foreign currency exchange means in a particular city I'm interested in, one of the most successful local foreign currency dealer has in his house he has a fridge and air conditioner, which would require power supply. A lot of rich North Koreans, of course there are rich and poor in this new system. There used to be two, but now the gap is larger. Every rich North Korean would buy a fridge, but it's seldom usable. Fridge is a status symbol. It's a bit like putting a Porsche on your driveway so everybody will see you can own it, but in a place where there is no fuel supply at all. But some people manage. So this particular currency dealer, he just has a very good agreement with the local boss of the political police. So a cable connects political police headquarters with the house of the rich hard currency dealer. So he has 24 hours supply of electricity. Very common way. You can bribe political police, you can bribe military, you can bribe power grid managers to get supply of electricity. It's expensive, but these people are rich. Some of them can even can afford motorbikes. So seriously rich people, you know. And of course fridges. But so this is a kind of the situation. So government was giving up until 2002. Then in 2002 they sort of admitted the changes, and from 2005 to 2009 they were fighting back. They spent roughly 5 years trying to push the situation back, introducing and trying to enforce new restrictions on the market activities. And right now, in 2009, this line culminated in 2009 when they had a currency reform. Currency reform was a complete and total failure. Have I had time, I would talk more about it, but I don't have time. Because I believe that people, by some reason, always overlooks the single most important item, which essentially destroyed entire project. And the item is, it was a usual confiscatory reform. So this old money were to be replaced with new money, but it was accompanied by 10,000% overnight increase in wages and salaries as a way to fight inflation. It shows you pretty much how knowledgeable and smart and wise is our dear leader Kim Jong-Il when it comes to working on market economy. And we shouldn't be surprised about it, because person probably has never ever went shopping in his life. So anyway, the idea was they essentially increased salaries 100 times, and of course very soon all prices increased 100 times to everything was like it used to be. So and from 2009, what was interesting, from 2009 over last almost 2 years, well, it was a complete disaster. They did not merely fail in pushing markets seriously back, because the idea was to confiscate private money. When they were changing money, private market operators usually keep their money and operating capital in cash. So the idea was to annihilate this type of cash supply. What happened? They did not succeed in that regard. They created a huge hell. For roughly a month in North Korea, in Pyongyang, they closed all markets, they closed hard currency shop. You could be, in general, you could be a black market dealer, you would not be able to buy food. So there was a great deal of signs of discontent growing in the country for these few months. They obviously were terrified by their own mistake. According to some reports, which I don't believe 100%, they executed the guy who was made responsible for the reform. I'm not certain whether it really happened. It was widely reported, but believe most of the reports you can about the inner politics on the top in North Korea you can find in media. They should not be trusted, because they are based on hearsay, rumors, inventions, fabrications, political manipulations. But anyway, they were seriously terrified, it's clear. And in May 2009, they made a new decision. There was a kind of unofficial letter to the local authorities telling, from now on, don't do anything, don't touch markets anymore. So it was a bit like it was in 2002. So over the last 2 years, North Koreans have basically, North Korean government have basically accepted that the market is growing and they cannot do much about it. And people are still making money in the market, as I have said, usually women, because males are still under great pressure to go to jobs, officially. You can buy your right not to attend jobs. There is a special term, the 3rd August money is an official contribution you pay to your employer for the right not to show off at work and the indoctrination session. And people pay it quite frequently, but on balance, men are under greater pressure. And now females are major breadwinners. They are making business. They trade, they produce, they sew stuff, they sew garments, they run smuggling operations, they work at the mountain plots, everything. And they run, essentially, they run family economies. They produce most of the money. Well, I think it's time for me to finish. Thank you very much.
About 5 minutes. Okay, Klitz. Okay.
Let me start. I would like to start with your opening as well, because I'm also wondering, whenever I travel to North Korea, what time period is this compared not only to the Soviet Union, but also compared to other countries in the world? And I came up after reading some books about China. It reminds me very much of the Cultural Revolution in China, economically as well as politically, when it comes concerning the political power and political influence. So what I would like to add to what Andrei just mentioned, he gave an introduction over the last 20 years. I've been visiting North Korea 20 times the last 4 years. So what I see and what my assessment goes back to the last 4 years, what has happened on the street. What I see, what information I get from the country. Our title today is Juche, the Death of Juche. But we are only talking about the economic part of Juche, because Juche is not only about economy and self-reliance of North Korea, it's also sovereignty, the question of sovereignty, and also political independence. So Juche has 3 components. But the economic side is, I think, the most important side. But you also have to look what has changed in the last years on the political side when you want to make the right assessment about the situation in North Korea. So when I'm in Pyongyang, I'm usually meeting officials of the International Department of the Workers' Party, and we have political discussions. We have discussions about the economic situation in the country. At the very beginning, they didn't say anything. So they didn't criticize the system. They don't criticize the system today. But it was even not possible to talk about the economic situation. But meanwhile, they're criticizing the economic situation. This has changed in the last 4 or 5 years very much. I just came back from a trip with 2 North Koreans to Germany, and they were again giving me some numbers, and this is just to add to your contribution, Andrei. The average income in North Korea is 4,500 North Korean won, which is, when you take the official exchange rate, it's more or less $25. When you take the unofficial exchange rate, it's the amount Andrei has mentioned. This was different after the currency reform 2 years ago, but all the problems they wanted to address with the currency reform, they are back. Inflation is back, the prices are back. Salaries are more or less on the same level, but the prices have skyrocketed, especially until spring last year. So to give you one price, potatoes are 1 kilo of potatoes are 2,500 North Korean won. 4,500, this is the average income, mostly paid in the cities. You have to very much distinguish between the cities and what's going on in the countryside. Also, when it comes to the food situation, actual food situation in North Korea. I had the opportunity just 2 months ago to travel on the countryside, and I usually travel on the countryside in North Korea. And to my surprise, the people I talked to from cooperatives, they said, you know, the food situation in North Korea, in our country, is not bad, especially on the countryside. We don't have a problem. Our problem is that we have to ship our products to the cities. This means to the nomenclatura. So the discussion you hear, it's a lot of propaganda. Andrei mentioned that, a lot of propaganda when you talk about North Korea. They don't have a food problem, they have a distribution problem, and they have a problem of allocation of financial resources. This brings me to one point, to one really important point. 5 years ago, my first trip to North Korea, I heard one number that they only had 5,000 cars 5 years ago. I don't know if it's true, but you could hardly see cars on the street. There was no traffic jam. But when you go to Pyongyang today or to Nampo, you see traffic jams. You see brand new cars. You see Porsche, you see Mercedes, you see BMWs, all the luxury goods which are prohibited to export to North Korea. So how is this possible? Where do they come from? Situation is quite clear for me as somebody who is representing a foundation which stands for classical liberalism, as this means for market economy. Wherever you wanted to have sanctions, it didn't work in South Africa. It does not work in North Korea either. Sanctions are bypassed, the economic sanctions are bypassed, and also the proliferation sanctions are bypassed by the Chinese. Trade between China and North Korea has increased by 35% in 2010. If you go to North Korea today, you see Chinese everywhere. You see a lot of Chinese tourists visiting Arirang, much more Chinese tourists than 5 years ago. You notice that China is investing hundreds of thousands of dollars or millions of dollars in North Korea. So the economic situation at the moment has not changed. It is officially, at least, it is still a planned economy. And a planned economy, as we know it, we know it from Russia, we know it from the former GDR, cannot work. Only when you have private property and you have a functioning economic system, market economy, you have the production you need to feed your people. So the institutions are still in place, but since the question of succession has to be guaranteed, the succession itself has to be guaranteed and has to be controlled. After the Party Congress in September 2009, after the Party Congress in 2009, the political power of the party has increased. The party has regained control, especially of the countryside, especially with the people Andrei mentioned who were somehow involved in illicit trading. So the countryside is doing quite well. In the city, they have shortages of food, and it's also a question of malnutrition. It's not so much a question of shortage of food, it's malnutrition of children and pregnant women. So at the moment, it's just to give you one number in Pyongyang, it's adults get 160 grams of rice at the moment. This is to survive. So thank you so much. In 5 minutes, very short.
I'm sorry, actually each of these guys could probably talk for 1 hour uninterrupted about North Korea. All day long, okay. But Mr. Kirk, please.
Thanks very much to both of you. Particularly Andrei spoke for 30 minutes, and thank you also for adding to what he said. When you talk about the countryside, I'm tempted to ask, where countryside? It's a big, big country. People think it's a small country, but it's not. And there's a lot of remote areas, so I don't know. When you say the countryside, are you talking about, between Nampo and Pyongyang? Are you talking about north of the DMZ? You're talking about the mountains in the northeast? Have you been all over those places? Just questions that come up, but we can talk about that later, perhaps. And I'm certainly impressed by all your knowledge of the rising power of the Workers' Party is very interesting. People always used to say that the National Defense Commission was the power, but there have been reports understanding that the Workers' Party may have gained a little bit more power. Of course, Kim Jong-Il is Secretary General of the Workers' Party, just as he's chairman of the National Defense Commission, so the power still goes to him. But it's interesting, and perhaps you would disagree with this, but it's interesting to me that the Workers' Party seems to have a little bit of increase in a little bit of anyway.
It seems to be better.
anyway. But as far as your remarks are concerned, I just commented on your remarks because you're the last one I heard, But as far as your remarks are concerned, I'm always interested in the relationship between all that you said and then the political stability and also the relationship of what you said to the question of the arrest, torture, execution, imprisonment of so many people. You didn't mention that, and I know you have a lot of thoughts on that, but that's another subject, perhaps another chapter. But what is the relationship between what you said and people going to jail? Are they going to these most severe prisons that we regard as part of a gulag system, or are they going to intermediate prisons? Are they not perhaps not going to prison if they can buy their way out of it? So the relationship between law and order, so to speak, and the regime's desire to discourage huge private markets that undermine regime's power, and the prison system, the gulag system, is always interesting. Also, obviously, I suppose the most severe complaint anybody can make would be to actually question the regime. It's one thing to be corrupt and so forth, but it's another thing actually to question the central power. And I suppose that would really land you in the depths of the gulag system. You might not even get that far. You might be executed before you even got to prison. So I'm interested in that, and I suppose I would be interested in your view of how all this is affecting succession. If Kim Jong-Un does come to power, may we expect some relaxation? Some people say that he's responsible for letting Orascom sell 600,000 cell phones. Is this an indication that he's going to be responsible for a whole lot of other reforms? Will he really want to keep up such a confrontational relationship with South Korea? On the other hand, people also say that Kim Jong-un had something to do with the Jong-Un attack and maybe with the Jong-Il attack. Not that anybody knows, but people say that sort of thing. And so is he going to be tough or not tough? Will he be influenced by his uncle-in-law, Jong Sung-taek, and will he be influenced by other generals, or will he be able to be his own man eventually, or is he strong enough to be his own man? We don't even know how strong a character he is. Maybe he's not very strong. Certainly the pictures of him portray this roly-poly youth who probably never had to go through rigorous basic training in the army and probably was never ordered to run 20 laps and do 100 push-ups. I doubt it, And who knows if he ever fired a rifle on the rifle range? Who knows? We don't know, actually. I don't know. Maybe you know. But, all these things that go on in other systems. I know in England, successors to the throne and so forth, their sergeants delight in torturing them during basic training. Here's their chance, to order this prince around. And there was a case of a prince who got kicked out of the British Marines because he wasn't good enough. Now, is there any such rigorous training going on for the North Korean elite, or do we know or not know?
We know it's not.
We know it's not. Okay. So I'm just interested in your relating all these insights and all this information and all this history, which you've outlined in such detail in 30 minutes. You've really given us quite a sketch of the ups and downs of the North Korean market system and so forth. I'm interested in your relating that to the power struggle in North Korea and to the human rights in North Korea, and one other relationship. What about this 1.1 million person military establishment? That's a lot of people just to be out there in uniform. I realize that a whole lot of them are actually not really operating as soldiers, but are working as workers and farmers. I mean, they're sent to the field. They were the ones with most dramatic illustration that all of us know is that the soldiers were the ones that built that barrage, the West Sea Barrage at Nampo, many years ago. One of the one of the proudest achievements of the Kim Il-sung era, they would have you believe. And soldiers also go out and do harvesting, right? And they dig ditches and lots of other things. But nevertheless, what's going to happen to this military establishment? Is there any chance that some of these people will be put to work in factories, really as real factory workers, not as soldiers on temporary duties in factories? Is there any chance of lowering the level of confrontation while perhaps improving economically? Do they have to have this? They have to have this huge armed force, and can they lighten up a little bit under prolonged efforts at reconciliation? There's a chance in South Korea that South Korea will move in the direction of reconciliation. There's going to be a new president in South Korea not a year from now, but there'll be an election in December of next year, and a new president the following February. Even if a conservative becomes president of South Korea, it's likely that conservative will take a more conciliatory view. So anyway, these are just questions that come out of your talk, and you know, I know you could probably talk for half an hour on each of the central questions I've raised: party, succession, military, etc. But nonetheless, whatever you can say would be helpful. And thank you for your remarks, because your remarks really supplemented and complemented what he said. Let's say I began my remarks by asking, how, when you talk about the countryside, what countryside? It's a big country, and it's very remote areas. You know.
3 to 4 hours north of Pyongyang.
3 to 4 hours north, that's on the main line to Chung-Ho. That would be a pretty good area, wouldn't it? What about off the main line?
No, not northeast.
Okay.
Not northeast.
No, not north. Chung-Ho is north.
No,
Okay,
I didn't go to northeast.
Geography later. Geography later. Okay, all right. Okay, now it is a roundtable discussion. So I would invite anyone else, if you have any questions or comments, if you could just say your name, maybe your affiliation, if you want to mention it. Okay.
Yes, I'm Peter Ward. I'm with Korea University. I just wanted to ask, the social contract that existed in North Korea before 1994 was you work for the government and the government gives you rations. That social contract is in a state of, well, near total collapse. And there is no new social contract as far as I can tell. Now, I'm wondering, can the regime co-opt the markets and create a new social contract where the regime promises to protect the markets in return for, yes, so you have a night watchman state in the classical liberal mold, where the regime provides a military, it provides a state and a police force, and the markets provide goods, services, etc., etc. If not, what's going to happen? And also, can the private economy that exists in North Korea today be integrated into a post-unification South Korean private economy? So those are my two questions.
Can I answer right now or what?
Yeah.
Yes. Sure. Yes.
Well, so yes. First of all, yes, social contract has collapsed. And your question, basically, I would say the regime can make such a social contract, but probably it's not smart enough to understand it. Because I'll tell something sort of challenging and provocative. In the long run, interests of the new emerging business class of North Korea do coincide with the interest of the regime. If there is no unification, if the North Korean state will survive in its current shape, people who are now, somebody who is now running a corner shop has some chances to become an owner of a supermarket chain. If there is regime collapse and unification, which is basically good for the vast majority of the North Koreans, I believe so. But in such a case, this elite will have to compete with the South Korean businesses. And without special protection, they will have no special protection, they have no chances to survive. So basically, elite should be interested in gradual evolution of the North Korean regime along the Chinese lines as a protector who will protect them from their South Korean potential competitors. However, I don't see it happening, honestly. I would think probability is very, very low. Because for the average North Korean businessman, officials are just parasites. Just parasites who do nothing and demand payoffs, while doing nothing. And for them, a happy coincidence is that for the officials, the private businessmen are parasites, or really it's usually businesswomen, a lot of women. Because they are just using our temporary difficulties and using this disarray which has happened to our glorious state, in which all these officials have their stakes. So yes, potential for some alliance is possible, but not very likely. Plus, we have a South Korean factor. I would probably dare to say something counterfactual. That is, that has South Korea not existed, North Koreans would start reforms back in the 1970s, before Chinese, before the Vietnamese. Because of all communist strongmen of East Asia, Kim Il-sung was probably the most rational, I would say the least irrational, and the most pragmatic. However, the South Koreans just behind the corner, they cannot afford to start reforms, because reforms means a level of freedom. In North China, it does become a problem, because Chinese are not exposed to the side of prosperity of another China. Taiwan is way too small. If North Koreans learn about South Korean prosperity, instead of tolerating a developmental dictatorship, North Korean style, they are far more likely to demand immediate unification on, unfortunately, naive expectations that such an unification will immediately bring the living standards which are similar to that you can see through this window. So the existence of South Korea makes all kind of political maneuver increasingly impossible. And probably I also answer some questions, or some Donald's questions. Well, about successions, I'm very careful when I talk about succession. Really, I don't talk about succession at all. Because maybe some people in the CIA and NIS, SVR, and all this, alphabetic soup of intelligence services have done a great job and somehow managed to penetrate the inner circle of Kim Jong-Il. If they did, my congratulations. But I'm not privy. To their secrets, unfortunately, or maybe fortunately. From my own vantage point, I cannot talk about politics of this type. I don't know anything about Kim Jong-un, period. I believe nobody. Maybe some people, maybe as I have said, some people in intelligence services know something, but I strongly suspect that even these guys make up reports to impress their bosses. In real life, we cannot talk about somebody of whom virtually nothing is known. And on top of that, I think that his logic, like logic any politician, if he or she is a successful politician, will be much more defined by the logic of the political situation than by his own inclinations. Because if you look, say, being Russian and direct attention to some episodes of Russian history, Yeltsin, who has such a great press of a great, democratic activist, blah, 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 he was seen as a reasonable hardliner. A kind of moderate hardline in the 1970s. Yeltsin was a kind of clean, modernizing, not conservative, but by no means a sympathizer of capitalism and Western democracy. And otherwise he would never become number 3 guy in the Communist Party. And that situation changed. As a good politician, he had instincts. He probably wanted to make life better, and he wanted to increase his own power in process, as any politician does. It's not a job of somebody without ambitions. So maybe Kim Jong-un is now a secret reformer, very secret. But when this situation will be unfavorable, he will be a hardliner, and vice versa.
Question?